Greetings, students. It is week 10, my goodness. And we are getting into Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz now. I'll just call him Leibniz from now on, if you don't mind. People often call him G.W. Leibniz, but I thought I'd give his whole name. Thought that might be helpful. So with Leibniz, we are squarely in the post-Cartesian era, right? His dates, Leibniz's dates are 1646 to 1716. So we're getting into the 1700s now a little bit. And I'll say again, as I've said many times, that Descartes, poor man, died in Sweden in 1650. He was cold and tired. So Leibniz was born 4 years before his death, so they could not have interacted at all as adults. Okay, so we're reading a few things from Leibniz. This week we're covering his Discourse on Metaphysics. Next week we're supposed to cover the Monadology and a chapter from the Theodicy. It's a summary chapter, so it'll help us understand the whole Theodicy, but we won't get as much detail as we would by reading the whole book, of course. So let's make some big points here before we get into details. Leibniz is obviously influenced by Descartes. He writes about him like one of the dead masters, like I might write about Leibniz, like, well, that was a while back, right? So I'm just emphasizing again, this is post-Cartesian. Leibniz respects Descartes, but he's looking back at something important that happened in the past when he talks about Descartes. In some ways, Leibniz is looking back toward the scholastics. Remember them? These people who were influenced by Thomas Aquinas, who were heavily into Aristotle, right? So Leibniz is going back to them in the sense that he is proposing a substantial form, right? And what does that mean? Well, if you are, I'm just putting my computer on mute because I just thought of it. If you are a materialist of some kind, or even if you're a dualist, as Descartes is, then you think of forms as superficial, right? They're ways that matter is formed, right? Certainly in the realm of bodies, when you're looking at bodies, which are material, form is superficial. It's not a deep property, so it doesn't have a deep metaphysical influence. So when Leibniz says, I believe in substantial forms, he means, well, I believe in a form that has a deep metaphysical influence that makes a real difference to how a substance behaves, whether it's a body or a spirit, right? Leibniz is complicated. He's an idealist, but I wouldn't say he's a monist. He's kind of like a monist. I mean, idealists generally are monists because they say, well, there are just ideas, there aren't bodies. But I wouldn't call Leibniz a monist because there are substances everywhere. So he actually believes in an unboundedly large number of substances, or we could just go ahead and say infinite substance. That term works. There's an infinite number of substances for Leibniz, if you like. We could put it that way, right? Pardon me. So, all of that is just to say, there are bodies, there are spirits, but they're equally substances, and in a way, everything is ideal. Everything is a matter of perspective. So we'll get into that. We'll figure out what that means. What is the point of bringing back something like a substantial form? The general issue for Leibniz is agency, right? Which is the ability to act, the ability to initiate action in particular, right? So how can we ascribe agency to an individual substance? How can the substance be distinct enough from its environment to have its own agency or its own spontaneity? That's what Leibniz is looking into. How can an individual substance be an initiator of action, right? So that's the metaphysical issue that Leibniz is pursuing. He throws the word metaphysical around a lot, and you might have wondered what exactly he had in mind when he used that term. Well, he's talking about something under the surface that's not phenomenal, right? Which is a pretty normal use of metaphysical even in the 21st century. But then he also means more specifically, how can something be the source of something else? How can it bring something into the world, right? That's the specific metaphysical issue that he is interested in. And that applies to spirits and bodies equally, just to be clear. He has a lot to say about force, which is clearly a physical issue. So that's what he's interested in when he looks at bodies. He thinks of force as something that initiates action, which makes sense. So then force is like will in the spiritual realm. Will brings about the action of spirits or organic beings, right? Okay, so that's the big picture. I hope that helps. Okay, so starting from section 1, we get this definition of God that Leibniz is going to use to generate some other points. This you can see some Spinozistic influence, I think, in the way that the text is written. Leibniz actually met Spinoza. We don't know everything they talked about, but Leibniz specifically made a trip to Holland, the Netherlands. It was called Holland at the time. Specifically made a trip there to talk to Spinoza. And when you look at the Discourse, you look at these numbered sections, you look at how careful the inferences are, I think you see a Spinozistic influence in the way that everything is arranged, right? It seems to me. I don't think this is quite as painstakingly careful as Spinoza's texts, but it's pretty tight, right? It's logically tight. It's not loose like Locke's text. Locke kind of wanders around an area of thought and looks at this and that. This text is somewhere between Spinoza's style and Locke's style, and a little closer to Spinoza, I would say. Okay, so anyway, we start in section 1 with this definition of God. God is absolutely perfect. What does it mean that God is absolutely perfect? That means God is perfect in every degree and dimension, in every possible realm in which perfection is possible. God has that perfection, right? And then Leibniz says there are some areas in which perfection doesn't make sense. So God is perfectly good, for instance. That makes sense. If you're always pursuing the good and you never make the choice to do anything less than what's most good, then you could be perfectly good. And God is perfectly wise. He knows and understands everything. It doesn't make sense to say, at least not from Leibniz's point of view, it doesn't make sense to say that God is perfectly vast, right? Does the universe have a size, and is that the largest size there is? Right? When you start asking questions like that, you end up with paradoxes, as Leibniz knows. So you could say the universe is an object, so that's the biggest object there is. But then, what if you go outside the universe, right? What if you draw a boundary around the universe, that extends for a mile outside of the outer edge of the universe? Well, now there's a bigger object, right? Or conceivably there could be, so it's not the biggest possible object, even if it's the biggest actual object. And what if it expands? We believe it's expanding, right? So what is the biggest object? Raising that question, tends to lead to paradoxes. Is the universe eternal, or does it have a beginning and an end? You get into the same kinds of issues. You try, because you're asking whether there's a boundary on something that is in some ways infinite, right? And we've sort of been over that with Spinoza. Well, if it's infinite, then nothing limits it, right? So how could there be a beginning and an end? But then, if there is no beginning and no end, that sort of blows our minds, right? So no matter how far back you go, there's always an earlier point. But how can the universe be when it never began? Paradoxes. Okay, so God is infinitely good, infinitely wise, perfectly good, perfectly wise, but not perfectly vast. Never mind that one. Okay, section 2, really, really interesting, especially if you've read Plato's Euthyphro. I would say section 2 is very much on the same wavelength as Socrates in Plato's Euthyphro. So some of you will get the reference. Not everybody has been through that, but maybe some other time you'll get to look at it. So in section 2, Leibniz rails against or complains about those who hold creation as good because it was created by God, right? So you might raise the question, well, what makes creation good? What makes the universe good? Some people want to say, well, it's good because God made it. And Leibniz thinks that doesn't work at all, right? It's not good just because God made it. There have to be independent criteria for its goodness. Why? Leibniz gives at least 3 reasons why, and I think they're interesting enough to go over. Number 1, God needed a reason or reasons to create the universe the way that he did. If the universe is good just because he created it, then it doesn't really matter how he created it or why he made it this way rather than that. It's good no matter what. But that Leibniz doesn't buy it. God actually made choices in creating the universe, says Leibniz. So God had reasons, so things are independently good, right? And not just because that's the way God made them. Number 2, the independence of the goodness of the universe makes God praiseworthy. In other words, we look at the universe and how good it is, and that goodness is independent of God, and that gives us a reason to praise God and say that God is great for making the universe so good. Whereas, if the universe is good just because God made it, then it doesn't matter what the universe is like, right? So we don't know what the criteria are for praising God. We're just praising God because we praise God. It becomes a trivial thing, right? I hope that makes some sense. If you read Plato's Euthyphro, you will get into the head-spinning nature of these problems. There's a lot here. I'm kind of skating on the surface, hoping it makes some sense. Point number 3, with regard to the independence of the goodness of creation, Genesis says, Leibniz is not above just appealing to the text of the Bible. Genesis says that God created all these things, including the heavens and the earth, and then looked at them and then said they were good. So the Bible tells us that God recognized the goodness of his creation, which means that it's not good just because he created it, but he saw something in it that inhered in it that's good, right? So that goodness is independent of God and what God did to bring it about. Okay, interesting. So clearly Leibniz read Plato. He makes references to Plato, so I would think that point of view is influenced by his reading of the Euthyphro. But I don't have enough historical detail to know that for sure. Seems very much to be the case. Okay, speaking of God creating things and exercising his will, here's a way in which Leibniz and Spinoza are not alike. There are plenty of ways in which they're alike. Leibniz is clearly a rationalist. But Leibniz actually separates the understanding and the will in a way that Spinoza wouldn't allow, right? So Leibniz is willing to say these are separate faculties that God has, not explicitly, but he talks about them separately as if they're separate faculties. And, right, he's saying that God had reasons for creating the universe this way rather than that way. So that means that understanding those reasons and then willing an action based on that understanding, those are two separate moments of the same act. They're distinguishable. They're separable moments. So Spinoza wouldn't have allowed that. Right. But Leibniz is making out, I don't know if you would like me putting it this way, but Leibniz is making out God's mind to be more like the human mind than Spinoza would allow. Maybe Leibniz would be okay with that. Right? I mean, he sets up a real kinship between God and us mortals, right? Right? We're compatible. We understand each other. God has a lot of sympathy for us because we're so alike. So I guess Leibniz would own it and say, yeah, I see more of a similarity between human minds and God's mind than Spinoza allows for. Okay, section 3 now. It'll go faster as we keep moving along. Section 3, this is on page 509 in the physical book, at least. Like Spinoza this time, this is something they have in common, Leibniz holds that God could not have made the universe any better than he did. And it follows from points he already made, which again suggests this is pretty well arranged, right? The inferences are pretty tight. But the fact that the universe couldn't have been made any better follows from the lack of arbitrariness. God doesn't do anything arbitrarily. He always does something with a reason. So what Leibniz says is every time God made a choice about how he was going to make the universe, right, he always chose the best possible option. Of course, he's God, right? So he's absolutely good. So again, we see the tightness of the inferences. We just went over God's absolute goodness. He's absolutely good. So whenever presented with a choice between A and B, or A, B, and C, or whatever it was, whichever option did the most good, God would choose that one, right? And so then the universe is as perfect as it can be. So some people would say that limits God's liberty, right? So of course God could have made the universe better because God can do anything God wants. God is free. Also, God is omnipotent, so God has the power to make a better universe. But Leibniz would prefer to emphasize God's goodness and wisdom, right? God saw what the options were very clearly and was able to ascertain which option was best, and of course picked it because he's absolutely good. So that's the way that Leibniz wants to look at it, which again, it's very in line with Socrates in the Euthyphro, Plato's version of Socrates at least. Okay, section 4 then, moving on, and again, I can't help but make these references. We just went over Spinoza. We know Leibniz met with Spinoza and actually spoke to him. So I'm going to say, unlike Spinoza in section 4, Leibniz is willing to look at God like a great geometer, someone who does geometry. Maybe that's an obscure word, or maybe it's not, and I'm being condescending. So God is like a great geometer or architect. God is efficient. God follows this regular order, as Leibniz puts it more than once. So everything is really well ordered, and God is efficient. And here I'll quote, because God created the world in the manner that is, quote, both the simplest in hypotheses and the richest in phenomena. So he got the most out of the least, which is why I keep using the word efficient, which I don't recall Leibniz actually uses, but he is saying, without using the word, that God's very efficient, right? And we should be impressed with God's craftsmanship and ingenuity, right? Which again suggests the universe is as good as it could be. So God got as much as possible out of as little as possible. Simplest in hypotheses, richest in phenomena. What a good craftsman, right? We should be impressed. There's an interesting take on miracles related to this point. So God is well ordered. God has set up a regular order of things, right? And we keep using the word God, but we still are moving towards secularity, I would say, because God is being praised for setting up a universe that works really well on its own, right? That's part of what Leibniz is saying. The universe works really well on its own. It's really well ordered. So even miracles are part of the order, right? So in a sense, Leibniz isn't going to put it this way, but in a sense, nothing is supernatural, which again is like Spinoza, right? Everything's part of the order. So there's a part of the order we understand, and there's a part that we don't understand. right? We're finite, so some things are obscure to us, of course. We're not able to image the whole universe inside of our own souls. So we grasp part of the order, and that's the part that we call natural. And then there are things that are part of a higher order that we don't grasp, and we call those supernatural, but they're not supernatural. They're part of a higher order that we don't understand. So in the usual sense of the term miracle, there are no miracles. In a sense, we're getting a theory of miracles, but the theory is telling us that miracles don't exist, right? Because everything is just really well ordered and nothing happens out of the order. Nothing extraordinary in the literal sense of extraordinary occurs. Only ordinary things occur. It's just that we don't totally know what's ordinary. We only grasp part of that. Hope that makes some sense. So lot of throwing around of the term God, just like Spinoza did. It's a little more theological with Leibniz. I don't mean this. Lots of differences, lots of similarities. I don't want to put them in completely the same boat. And I still say we're moving towards secularity here. So that's one of our big themes, as I've mentioned. Okay, so section 8, page 511 in the physical book. The conception of an individual substance is introduced specifically as something that will help us distinguish God's activities and the activities of created beings, right? So that's the point I was making about agency previously, right? So he says it there in section 8. I think it's pretty clear. The whole point of having a conception of an individual substance is to talk about how something could stand out enough from its environment to do an activity of its own that is not directly attributable to God, which will eventually get to issues of free will down the line, right? Not surprisingly. But that's the point. So some things are only indirectly attributable to God, right? So everything comes from God. Everything's attributable to God. But not everything comes directly from God. Gosh, that sounds Spinozistic, doesn't it? Okay. Page 512, still section 8. Things are getting a little weird, right? But in a new way, in Leibniz's own special way. He says we can speak of an individual substance, right, a distinct substance, when all the true predicates concerning a subject can be deduced from the concept of the subject. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, a really simple example that doesn't tell you anything about substance specifically, but an example is when you say, all bachelors are unmarried men. Why is that true? Well, because bachelor is defined as unmarried man. So when you say a bachelor is an unmarried man, bachelor is the subject, is an unmarried man is the full predicate, but unmarried and man, those elements of the predicate came out of the subject, because if you analyze the subject, which is bachelor, right, you see that it means unmarried man. So, seems a little weird, but what Leibniz is saying is that that's what makes for a substance, is if you can analyze its concept and then you know all of its actions. So bachelor is just an example. You know, bachelor is a general category. It's not a substance. I already said that, but I want to be clear. I'm a substance, right? And I'm an unmarried man. But my unmarried manness is not by itself a substance, right? Just I am, right? And what Leibniz is saying is there's a concept of me, there's an essence of me, and if we could see it, which we can't, God can see it. We can't fully see it. We can sort of see it fuzzily, I guess. If we could really truly see it, we would see everything I ever did and everything I will do, and of course everything I'm doing, right? Because my actions come out of my essence, they emanate from my essence, right? Because I'm a true substance, right? And so are you. So be proud of your substancehood, I suppose. Okay, so down the rabbit hole a little more here. Section 9. Each substance reflects the whole universe in its own way. Each substance contains the whole, but it has a distinct perspective. It has a distinct perspective. And the funny thing is, or at least I would say so, the funny thing is, perspective is possible because of our finitude. Okay? So God contains all perspectives because God's infinite. But I have a specific perspective because I'm finite. So some things are more obscure to me than others. Some things are more clear to me than others. That's what makes for a perspective. It's the relative clarity and obscurity, right? And Leibniz will throw in later that this has something to do with my body and how I connect to my body, and that creates some kind of perspective in the universe of all the things that there are, right? And because of where I'm situated in connection with my body, I have this perspective from which, well, these things are clear. In some sense, they're nearby, and in some sense, these other things are far away. I'm putting this all in quotes because Leibniz is an idealist. Space is phenomenal, right? It's not a deep metaphysical existing thing, right? It's phenomenal. So at least virtually, in the Matrix, or however you want to think about it, in this big arcade game that we're playing, so virtually at least, some things are nearby and some things are far away. But what that amounts to is I understand some things clearly and I understand some things relatively obscurely. And that constitutes a perspective that I have on the whole universe. Okay. Interesting, I hope. So the idealism becomes clear in section 12, right? And Leibniz actually says extension is, in a way, imaginary. So I don't like that he hedges his bets, but he does. So extension is, in a way, imaginary. What does he mean by that? Well, okay. I mean, big picture. The big picture here is he's having a fight with the Cartesians. Remember, Descartes thinks extension is the essence of body, and Leibniz is saying, no, that's not true. So Leibniz is around at the same time as Newton, and they had a lot of arguments, mostly indirectly. They both discovered the calculus. They had a fight over that. Newton thought space was absolute. Leibniz thought space was relative. Leibniz turned out to be right, it seems. They thought about that through a third party, it seems. Anyway, the point is, Leibniz is having some of the same thoughts that Newton is having. Leibniz realizes that there's something in matter such that when it's more dense, it can generate more force in a fall, right? So Galileo already established that falling bodies, when they fall in a vacuum, they fall at the same rate, which was surprising, right? So it doesn't matter that this body is heavier. If they're falling in a vacuum, they're going to fall at the same rate. However, some of them will create more force on impact. And those are the ones that are more massive, which isn't a matter of extension. The volume isn't the issue. Some bodies are more massive than others. Now Leibniz doesn't use the word mass. He's not, as far as I can tell from what we're reading now, he's not there yet. He wrote this work, the Discourse on Metaphysics, in 1686, or he published it in 1686. Newton's Principia was published in 1687. That's very interesting timing for us because we're seeing some Newtonian insights here, but the Principia isn't available yet. So, of course, Leibniz hasn't read it, but there's some of the same thoughts. Leibniz is having some of the same thoughts, which is why he and Newton both developed the calculus, because they were having some of those same thoughts. In any case, bodies aren't essentially extension, even though Leibniz isn't using the word. Bodies have something in them, we'll call it mass, that allows some to generate more force as they're falling than others. So there's something in there that's deeper than extension. So then extension, by comparison, is phenomenal. I'm using that word. Leibniz actually said, in a way, imaginary. That seems to be what he means, that mass is a deeper property, and extension is a much more superficial property. So Descartes was just wrong. He really, really got it wrong on that one. Okay. Section 13. To understand agency properly, which I think is the main thrust of this text. To understand agency properly, we have to distinguish what is contingent and completely certain from what is necessary. Well, why do we need to do that? Because all of my actions are foreknown by God, who can see my essence clearly. But we don't want to say that all my actions are necessary, because then I don't have free will. And Leibniz believes I do, and that I'm responsible for my actions, and that God will judge me. So Leibniz is willing to defend the conventional view, according to which I'm morally responsible, and God is going to hold me accountable, right? So, my actions are known ahead of time, but they're contingent, which is the opposite of necessary. How are they contingent? Well, right now I'm giving a lecture, but it's not impossible for me to be taking a walk right now. I could have decided to go on a walking spree and go get a Dr. Pepper. I think I've done this before. Start talking about sweet things I want to have instead of giving my lecture. Sorry, that's what comes to mind. What can I do? Yeah, so it's not impossible for me to be doing something else right now. Therefore, it was certain to God, at least, that I was going to be doing this right now, but it's contingent, that is to say, conditioned on other things, not necessary. If something is necessary, like 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's necessary because if you deny it, you get contradictions, right? If you say 2 plus 2 is not equal to 4, then what? Well, subtract 2 from either side, like you often do in a math classroom. So 2 plus 2 is not equal to 4, subtract 2 from either side, you get 2 is not equal to 2 by subtracting 2 from both sides. 2 is not equal to 2 is very much a contradiction. So 2 plus 2 equals 4 is necessary. Dr. Ogle is currently giving a lecture, not necessary, contingent. Certain, foreknown, but contingent. I mean, as far as that goes, Leibniz has a good point. Section 14, the appearances and perspectives of the various substances are coordinated. So it's the Matrix, or, we're in some kind of arcade game or something like that. And we all have a different perspective on the arcade game, right? But it's still a unified game. I mean, I don't know much about World of Warcraft, but it's a World of Warcraft, so my understanding is and I'm sorry if I'm wrong, different players insert themselves in different parts of the game, and so there's a game that's going on, right? And it's virtual, or phenomenal, but different players have different points of view on it, and so they're getting different phenomena, but the phenomena are coordinated. It's like that. That's what's going on in Leibniz, seems to me. So I mean, it's similar to Spinoza, where the mental realm and the bodily realm are coordinated, except in Leibniz now you have infinite substance, so there's an infinite number of points of view, and they're all coordinated. God can handle it, I mean, basically it's God that's coordinating them, right? Because everything is emanating from God ultimately. So again, that's similar to what's going on in Spinoza. In section 15, this is page 517 now, if you did want to look physically at the page. Finite substances don't directly interact. This is not surprising. This is also Spinozistic. We can say that one object causes another object to do something, but it's just a manner of speaking. What's really going on is the influential object is having an increase in its degrees of expression. It's expressing something in it more than it did before. And then the object that is being influenced or being acted on, it's having a decrease in its degrees of expression. So it's expressing something less than it did, right? I mean, a simple way to look at that is one object hits another and knocks it off its course, right? If the first object stays on its course, then it's expressing itself, even more, because it was seemed to plow through this other object, and this other object is expressing itself less because now it's going in a different direction, one more determined by the first object. So that one expressed itself more. It even had an influence, seemed to, on this other object, and the second object is expressing itself less. Makes sense, right? Well, you tell me. Send me an email if it doesn't make sense. Section 17. Okay, yeah, that gets complicated. Basically, Leibniz sets up a physics problem. This is the sort of thing you might work on in a physics class, in my experience. So I already mentioned that Leibniz is taking Galileo's experimental results for granted, and I don't want to get into this as a physics problem. I don't think that that's good for any of us. What I do want to say is that Leibniz keeps using this phrase, quantity of motion. That's what we call momentum. So objects transmit motion to each other sometimes. They have momentum and they can transmit it to each other. So when he says quantity of motion, that's momentum. And then he uses the word force. And what he's saying is force and momentum are distinct things, right? And part of what's going on is that Leibniz understands the universe as dynamic in a way that Descartes didn't appreciate, right? So momentum is mass times velocity. Force, which is one of the things Descartes didn't appreciate, force is not mass times velocity, which is what you would think if you thought force and momentum were the same thing. Force is mass times acceleration. Acceleration is the rate of change of velocity, right? So, in other words, force, when it's continually applied, continually changes velocity. So this is getting very much into Newtonian territory, right? Objects at rest tend to stay at rest, in motion tend to stay in motion. So if an object is going at a certain velocity, it tends to stay at that velocity. But if you keep applying a steady force to it, the velocity will keep increasing, so you get acceleration, right? So force is related to acceleration directly. Momentum is related to velocity, right? So I hope that makes sense. I don't think it would be good in a philosophy course to get into the physics problem as a physics problem, but the more philosophical way of looking at it is Leibniz is appreciating how dynamic the universe is, and he's realizing that force again is related to acceleration, which is inherently a dynamic concept. But Descartes and the Cartesians had tied force to velocity, which is inherently a static concept. Okay, so hope that helped. Section 19. Final causation. There's a lot here in the Discourse on Metaphysics about final causation. This stuff, it doesn't work as well as Leibniz would like. He wants to reintroduce final causation to physics. Ultimately, Descartes was successful on that point. I would say Descartes successfully banished final causation from physics. However, here's a way to look at it, and Leibniz is successful to this extent. If you think about the generation of a bird, in other words, a bird gets conceived and is born and grows up into a bird, there is a mechanical aspect to that. In other words, there are materials that the bird is made of, and you can look at cell separation, mitosis. You can see how that works mechanically at a molecular level. So that's looking at it like a Cartesian, right? You're treating the generation of the bird as a material matter, and that's all fine. However, there's also the perspective that you take when you say the bird is designed to fly. Okay, well that makes sense of a lot of aspects of the bird, like the the bones of a bird are, relatively speaking, they're hollow. They're not literally hollow. They're not very dense at all, right? Why? Well, because the bird has to fly, right? And so you have to get enough lift with the wings to lift a certain mass, and you want to reduce the mass as much as you can. So, okay, so the bones aren't very dense. This makes sense. This makes sense. When you look at the bird as if it were something designed, everything fits together really well. So that's what works, right? So Leibniz is trying to introduce final causes in a general way and bring God back into physics in a general way, although he still says when you're looking specifically at like a specific physics problem, it's silly to bring God into it. But anyway, he's trying to bring God back in. I don't think it works. I think what works is, well, there are these two perspectives. There's the design perspective and the material perspective, and they're both really vital. And by the way, you do see something similar in Plato's Phaedo, which is a later dialogue that Plato wrote. You see something like these two perspectives, right? And that works. I mean, that we're kind of stuck with, and we wonder what it means. I mean, we don't think birds. In general, secular culture, we don't think birds were designed per se, but when we look at them as objects of design, we understand a lot of different things about them. Kant, by the way, commented on this in his third critique, which is called the Critique of Judgment. And Kant was very clear, and by the way, I'll remind you again, Kant's kind of the culmination of this period. Kant made it clear that, well, this doesn't prove there's a designer, right? But it is the tendency our mind has to jump to a designer, because when you look at things that cohere really well and the pieces fit together really well, then you can't help but see design. But that's us. That's the way we are. It doesn't tell us there's a God. It tells us more about how our mind works, how the different faculties of the mind work, together or separately. That was Kant's take on it. I can't get any deeper than that because we're not actually covering Kant. But this section 19 is a very interesting moment that has these different iterations throughout the history of philosophy. And one of the iterations is Kant's third critique, in a way. The whole critique is about these two different points of view. Okay, beginning at section 23, Leibniz develops a theory of error that's similar to what we've seen before, so we don't want to spend a lot of time on it. He distinguishes ideas from conceptions, right? Conceptions are what I would call occurrent ideas, which just means that's the idea that's in your head right now. Leibniz wants to reserve the word idea for something that's always in you, right? That's part of your essence. So remember, your soul, your essence expresses the whole universe. So there's an idea of everything that exists in the soul, and those are the true ideas. And then there are occurrent ideas. There are the things you're holding in your mind at any moment. But anyway, where does error come from? Well, you have a limited perspective. So you're using an idea, you have this occurrent idea, and it could just be missing something, right? Because of your limited perspective, it could be a confused idea. So you could be using the name of something, but the idea that's attached to the name isn't a full idea. It's not the true idea, right, that God can see. And of course, if you use an idea like that that's missing things in a piece of reasoning, you can generate the wrong results. You can arrive at the wrong conclusions. So that's how error is possible, and that's very similar to things that Descartes and Spinoza already said. We are close to the end here, by the way, I promise. Section 27, which is on page 524 in the physical book. It's only in a manner of speaking that knowledge comes from the senses. That's not surprising. Leibniz is definitely a rationalist. So we can say that if we want. We can say knowledge comes from the senses, but it's only a manner of speaking. It's not literally true at a deep metaphysical level. So we do have a perspective, and so some things are closer and some things are farther, right? And there could be something nearby that clearly, strongly expresses something that causes us to have a certain idea. So we influence ourselves. There is no, we've already said this, there is no direct interaction between two finite substances, but there could be something near to me, since I have a perspective, that expresses something really well that's causing me to have a certain idea. So the cause is in me, but here's this thing nearby that is expressing that cause really well. So I'm getting my image from the thing that's nearby, in a sense. So it seems to me, given my perspective. So then I'm going to say that knowledge is coming from that object through the senses, but that's not literally what's happening. I'm just getting knowledge from my own ideas that are within me. Section 30, Leibniz does adopt Descartes' doctrine of indifference of the will. Remember, the will is indifferent in itself, but then you give it ideas, and if they're clear and distinct, speaking of Descartes right now, they can sort of motivate the will to move in a certain direction. So Leibniz takes that idea that the will is essentially indifferent and embraces it. Yes, in itself, the will is indifferent. He kind of has to say that at this point because he's been saying that the will isn't necessitated. So any act of the will is contingent, not necessary. Therefore, the will must be indifferent in itself. He mentions Judas a couple of times, which is always interesting to me. Judas, part of the point of bringing up Judas is, Judas is responsible for betraying Jesus. But also, why does Judas exist at all? So fine, Judas's actions are free, contingent, but why did God allow Judas to exist? Well, of course, because that created the best possible outcomes for the whole universe. Very similar to things Descartes said. Also, Leibniz goes a little farther and says, you look at Judas, there are an infinite number of beings who could have been created instead of Judas and sort of inserted into the same slot, basically, is how he puts it, how Leibniz puts it. And God thought that guy, Judas, he could see Judas. He could see Judas's essence, in which were embedded all of Judas's actions, future and past, all future, I guess, since we're talking about God possibly creating Judas. So God looked at Judas's essence and the essence of an infinite number of other beings who could have been inserted into the same spot and said, that one's the best. Not the best person. That's not the point. The point is, again, thinking of Descartes, the universe is a tapestry. It has to all hang together in a certain way. The universe is good. We can't pick out little pieces and say that piece is absolutely good, or either, we shouldn't say either that it should be absolutely good. No, God created a universe. The universe should be good and is good. But yeah, Judas wasn't so great, at least from Leibniz's point of view. I'm not sure I have a strong opinion about Judas, and not sure whether Judas existed. I have no idea. But supposing Judas existed, seems like a betrayer. Okay, well that's bad. Okay, but the redemption had to happen. Jesus had to be crucified to save people from their sins, and Judas was the best vehicle for that, apparently, right? So God went ahead and created him. Okay, and in section 33, Leibniz tells us something about the relation between soul and body. And this is where he says that the connection to the body is the source of the definite perspective you have on the universe. I don't actually find this as clear as Spinoza's view. Why are you connected to that body? Spinoza has an elaborate story to tell there. Leibniz isn't telling a similarly detailed or substantial story. He's just saying that you're tied to a body, you're connected to a body, and it allows you to have a perspective on the universe of things. But how did you get connected to that body? In general, God thought that was best. It's not like there's no answer here, but Spinoza had a lot of detail that was interesting regarding the connection between mind and body, and we're not seeing that in the Discourse on Metaphysics, which is fine. Leibniz is his own guy. He can do what he wants. Okay, well, I hope it's been interesting. I know this is a bit long. I thought it was gonna go over an hour. I was afraid of that, but if I put it into 2 lectures, I think that's worse. I don't know, actually. You tell me. I'm trying to encourage you to tell me things, So there's a discussion forum in which you can raise questions about the lecture. So raise a question, make a comment, say, hey, I would have much rather had 2 30-minute videos. Hey, this is fine. I didn't want to switch to another video. I'm glad you put it all in one video. Whatever floats your boat. Just put it there. Put it in the forum. All right, thanks. It's been a hoot.